Welcome to Wall Residence's online training series on documentation. In this first of two videos, we will cover the definition of documentation, why we document, the difference between billable, supplemental, and required documentation, the components of all documentation, and how to handle errors or make corrections. What is documentation? Well, documentation is simply the preserving of information. While there are many ways of preserving information, Wall Residences does so by way of a combination of written and electronic format. Documents, be it written or electronic, are considered a legal accounting of services delivered and verification that regulatory standards are met. Essentially, professional documentation is necessary to verify the work that we do, is the vehicle by which we are paid, and the means in which we prove that we meet ongoing standards. If done correctly and thoughtfully, documentation can also protect when services and standards of compliance are questioned or reviewed. Our documentation needs to satisfy all three regulatory entities that oversee compliance and reimbursement. Those are licensing, Medicaid, and human rights. In order to provide and receive payment for services, a license must first be obtained. The Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services provides the regulation for which residential services can operate. Essentially, licensing verifies that the license holder, Wall Residences, meets all areas of regulation before it will permit the agency to operate its business. Regulation includes standards for employees, contracted providers, the home or structure, and the services to be delivered. The licensing regulations pull from various other areas of the Code of Virginia to enforce and follow up on for the purposes of compliance. The Office of Human Rights also falls under the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services umbrella. This entity is responsible for assisting the department in fulfilling its legislative mandate to assure and protect the legal and human rights of individuals receiving services in facilities or programs operated, licensed, or funded by the department. This office also has a set of regulation based on the Code of Virginia for which Wall Residences is also obliged to comply with. Wall Residences, as the licensed agency, is responsible for verifying that all of the regulations from licensing and human rights are met on an ongoing basis. This verification comes in the form of documentation. Medicaid is the entity that outlines what services will be covered for payment. Medicaid is health insurance, and like all insurances, there is a set of policies and regulation that dictate what services can be provided for reimbursement. Of the three entities, only Medicaid reimburses for services delivered. It is their regulation that we follow in order to provide documentation that we refer to as billable for the purposes of providing proof that payment was made for services that are approved to be delivered. Wall Residences documentation systems are built to satisfy all three of the entities reviewed. The culmination of documentation types can be broken down into three categories: billable, supplemental, and required documentation for verification of compliance. We will first review billable documentation. Billable means any active intervention that the direct support provider took to carry out the individual's plan for support. Active interventions are steps taken with the individual to include, intervene, or otherwise help the individual to complete the necessary tasks as outlined in his or her plan. Actions such as physical help, verbal direction or instruction, teaching a skill, or intervening to redirect towards an expected outcome are examples of active intervention. Think of billable documentation as a receipt of services provided to Medicaid in exchange for payment. Progress notes are the primary vehicle for recording billable events. Supplemental documentation is any additional documentation that further clarifies the services delivered or provides additional information about interventions or steps taken during the delivery of services. A few examples of supplemental documentation are seizure logs, medication administration records, and behavioral tracking logs. All other documentation recorded is considered required for the purposes of verifying compliance with regulation and policy. The activities and tasks recorded in this type of documentation is not considered payable by Medicaid. Examples include training logs, supervision visits, and annual safety checks. Be it billable, supplemental, or required to verify compliance, all three categories of professional documentation have three common components. All documentation is accurate, objective, and observable. All professional documentation begins with accurate information: the correct time, the correct dose, the actual location, who did what, when, where, and how. Accurate documentation is synonymous with factual information. All professional documentation is objective, meaning that the written accounting of events and interventions is unbiased, neutral, detached, and/or otherwise impartial. The writer avoids interjecting personal values or opinions about what he or she is writing about. And finally, professional documentation is an accounting of events and interventions that is observable. Observable means what is being written was seen, felt, or heard. Now let's take a few minutes to review a few tips on how to plan for accurate, objective, and observable documentation. Tip 1. Take a few minutes to process events. Documenting while in a heightened emotional state easily sets up the professional to interject personal opinions or judgments that could end up being harmful or questioned in a legal proceeding or regulatory review. Tip 2. When documenting, create the space and time necessary to complete the information. Being in a hurry almost always sets up the professional to omit information, make errors, or include non-essential, non-objective information. Tip 3. Be clear. Professional documents are clear about who did what, when, where, and the response or outcome of the activity and intervention. Let's break these elements down. Who provided the intervention? This is you, the direct support professional. What action or intervention was taken? What steps were taken to complete the task or activity? Where did the task, activity, or event take place? Did it take place at home, in the kitchen, at the grocery store? What action did the individual take? In other words, what steps did the individual take to complete the task without intervention? And finally, what is the result or response of the activity of the intervention? What were the results? Will you do this again? Was the intervention or activity successful? What did the individual say or do as a response? And finally, tip 4, know the goal of your documentation. Professionals know the purpose of each of the forms of documentation entered into a record. By knowing the purpose, the writer can truly focus on the information that is needed to satisfy the requirements of the document. For example, if a specific form is used to document medications administered, then the goal is to verify who gave the medication, what medication, and when it was administered. Remember, the components of all documentation include accurate, objective, and observable information. Once a document is entered into the record, it is considered final and no changes are to be made to that document. But sometimes errors or omissions happen. So let's briefly cover the basic requirements of handling a mistake or making a correction. If you have entered incorrect information on a handwritten document, The expected practice is to cross out the error with a single line only, then initial and date. If information has been omitted from the handwritten or electronic document, the expected practice is to enter a late entry note. Typically, this is in the form of creating a new document titled Late Entry for the name of the document and the date of the original document, then providing the information, the date the document is entered, and then signing. Incorrect information in an electronic document is handled in the same manner as a late entry. A new form is entered with the name and date of the document for which information was omitted, the details that were omitted, dated for the date of the late entry, and a signature. This concludes the first video training in the series on documentation. Please take a few moments to complete the quiz that follows.